one and only weapons of mass destruction, whistleblower. How you doing, Ritter? You doing okay? You doing okay this morning?
I'm doing well. I'm like anybody who's been following these issues, trying to figure out what's going on, why is it going on, how it happened. Anybody who claims that they have the absolute knowledge of this is probably confused as anybody else.
I am shocked. Yeah. I am legitimately shocked. The last time around this happened, Bashar al-Assad fought like grim death, meaning holding on to power. And even to the point where the majority of Syria had been taken at that point, he still stayed and fought. This time around.
Yeah, the lion.
Yeah, I mean, this time around, not so much. Didn't give any statements. The people threw down their weapons and left. And even in some, pockets where the Syrian military fought, the overwhelming majority, they just weren't fights. They just left. I was showing the audience where Russians were showing the equipment that was just laying on the ground where the Syrians had basically abandoned it. Even like heavy, like tanks, heavy armored vehicles, all of that stuff was just left behind as they left. At this point, Israel has taken to decapitating the country, moving all the way 20 kilometers to Damascus. I mean, from your assessment of it, and I'm going to have right many questions this time around just because I'm somewhat confused about all of this. Why did it fall so quickly? Why did they throw down their weapons and leave? Why didn't Assad fight this time around? What happened from your point of view as far as you can tell?
Well, again, I'm still digging into this. Look, there's things that we did know. We did know that the Ba'athist government of Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, was a government that was composed of an Alawite minority. The Alawites are a religious offshoot of the Shia faith. I don't want to get into theocratic discussions here. The majority of the population of Syria is Sunni. We can also say that Syria, like Iraq, is an artificial country, meaning that it was put together by Western hands drawing lines on a map. And it brought together people that may have lived under Ottoman rule, but that Ottoman rule, they had a governorate. They had that reported to Istanbul, Constantinople. Now they became a nation, and the nation has always been struggling with itself. And the same thing happened in Iraq when the Ba'athist government that eventually was led by Saddam Hussein. You have an idea of nationalism that's trying to cobble together different groups. When you have tribes, Arab tribes that cross boundaries, if you go out into south northeastern Syria, the tribal elements that are there, their loyalties are to the tribes, and many of those tribes look elsewhere besides Damascus for their rule. So here comes this minority that's trying to create a nation state, and he does it by surrounding himself with loyalists, people he can trust. And early on in a Ba'athist movement, a Ba'athist revolution, because they came to power through revolution, you have people that believe in the revolution. But eventually what happens is you dig in, and because there is no democracy, you become that, I guess, which you despise. Hafez al-Assad stopped being a revolutionary leader and became a dictator. And the people around him stopped being revolutionaries, and they became sycophants to a dictator. And they began to enjoy the privileges of power. And this is the problem, the notion of the privileges of power. They set up their own little economic fiefdoms to enrich themselves. They become very wealthy while other people don't. And they rule through fear. because revolutionaries, that's what revolutionaries do. They rule through fear. And then if you haven't, knocked off the old regime and replaced something that empowers the people, you end up ruling the people through fear. The groups that were opposed, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood, if you remember the 1980s, early 1980s in Homs, there was a horrible massacre. There was fighting. A military academy was attacked by the Muslim Brotherhood revolutionaries, counter-revolutionaries, if that's how you want to view it. And the city was surrounded, bombarded, and the Muslim Brotherhood was ejected from Syria. And anybody who was associated with them were rounded up, put in prison, and life was not good. In fact, his life usually ended. This was the government of Hafez al-Assad. When they moved into Lebanon to counter or to take advantage of the power vacuum that took place in Lebanon when the Israelis invaded, there was a civil war, etc. Syria moved in to help, install stability, and the Syrian forces occupied Lebanon. And what happened is that occupation turned into, again, sort of a colonial occupation where the general who was in charge, this was his fiefdom. He became very rich and the corruption was rampant. You had a Syrian army that, believed in the nation. They fought, and they were very good. I mean, even though they were defeated in 1973, they fought hard. The Syrians fought hard in Lebanon. They're the basic soldier stock is not a bad stock. We saw that when they resisted everything that happened later. In 2000, when Hafez al-Assad died, power was supposed to be turned over to the older brother of Bashar, but he died in a car accident. He had been groomed to be the next Hafez al-Assad. That means that all of the governors, the corrupt governors, because again, the problem with corruption is that everybody's corrupt. The government is corrupt. Everything becomes a money-making opportunity. Any business that succeeds will have the knock at the door and say, let's thank you for setting up our business. It's our business. Now you can become a minority. And anybody who objects because this is a brutal regime gets arrested and put in prison. That was the reality. And this dentist, this younger son who never wanted to be president, this was not his ambition. He was happy being a London-educated dentist, was suddenly told, you're the president of Syria. And he came in and he hadn't been groomed. He didn't know the generals. He didn't have corrupt agreements with the governors. He came in and thought he was going to change things. He came in and when this is bad, I'm going to change things. And one of the first things he did is shut down the Lebanese occupation, and the corrupt general, he fired that general, shut down that whole corruption thing, tried to take it down. And he immediately ran into a buzzsaw of opposition inside Syria from all the Baathists and the generals who had their own fiefdoms who said, you can't do that. He's one of us. And there was problems. And so that process of trying to take down corruption caused him to step back and think, okay, well, I'm going to work with these people to reform these people. And that was one of his constant struggles, working to reform Syria with people who were used to the corruption of the father and were not willing to give that corruption up. And he started to make progress. It was imperfect. There were lurches and all that stuff, but then history conspired against him. First of all, 6 years after he came into power, as he's trying to do these things, there's a drought in Syria, and that drought led to massive problems in the countryside. And Bashar al-Assad, remember, I just want to remind people, he didn't want to be president. He wasn't groomed to be president. He wasn't prepared to be president, and he became president. And so now 6 years in, while he's trying to fight and reform, you have these giant problems, and he fumbled it. The Syrian government did not do a good job in responding to the needs of the people in the countryside to the drought. People fled the countryside, came to the city, and there was no plan to deal with them. And so there's this problem. And then to make up for, you had this issue of villages that had been abandoned, crops that weren't being planted. Money started coming in from abroad. Saudi Arabia started investing. But when Saudi Arabia invests, it's not just the money. the Wahhabists come along. Next thing you know, there's an imam that comes in with the money to rebuild the mosque, to become the center of the cultural and religious heart of this village that's going to be revived. They rebuild the village, the people return, but now there's an imam who's now saying, motivating people. And half the things they say is, remember who came to save you and remember who abandoned you. And so now you start to get dissent taking place there. Within the fractured society because of this, the Muslim Brotherhood starts to return. They had fled to Turkey, which had received them. And suddenly Erdogan, who was the best friend of Assad, because when Assad was young, when he first became president, he's just imagine being a 30-year-old, dentist with a beautiful wife and a family. What do? Well, you work, and then you go on vacations, and you're a fun guy. I mean, carefree life. And he used to go out on vacation with Erdogan. They used to talk. Erdogan sort of like the older brother that Assad had lost. And so Erdogan would bring him in and talk to him, say, hey, this is how you do things. Don't worry about that. This will work out. We'll make this happen. But the fact is, no matter what Erdogan told Assad, the regime, the Ba'athist regime, wasn't going along with it, because it's all about the money, all about the corruption. 2011 comes along, Arab Spring, and now the West decides that they're going to bring down Bashar al-Assad. Because there's the other aspect of what's going on, that Syria has always been a thorn in the side of the Arab League, etc. Syria, yes, Egypt and Syria were allied in their war against Israel, but Syria aligned against Iraq. If you look at the old there's a name for it, the Arab Republic or something, you had 3 stars. Those 3 stars were Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Well, Syria and Iraq had been going at it. Syria sided with Iran during the Iran-Iraq war and supported Iran, and so there's a lot of Arab nations, there's a lot of enmity towards Assad, especially in the Gulf Arab states. And so when
that was resolving, though, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought that was resolving. Like, this time around, from my understanding, Turkey, Israel, and the United States effectively had all sorts of reasons for trying to get rid of Assad. Turkey stabbed both in the back. Well, Turkey stabs Putin, and for that matter, Iran, in the back in the Astana agreements that they effectively just blew off. And I guess my thought is, I agree with you in the very beginning, all of those Gulf states were trying to get rid of Assad, but I thought they had resolved those issues. Assad seemingly was getting closer back into the kind of Arab states.
Well, but you can't see, you can't jump. That's why I was going through this thing, because
okay, go for it.
One of the problems that's happening today is everybody's jumping to the present. For instance, again, I'm not a defender of Erdogan. I'm not, but you can't just sit here and say he blew off Astana. You want to know why? Because Astana was imposed on him. If I came to you and said, Jamal, sit down, here's a gun to your head, sit down, shut up, sign the paper. And then later on, when you became a little bit more powerful, you went, I'm not so happy about that paper you made me sign.
I see.
Did I stab you in the back? Did you stab me in the back when you said, I'm not doing that anymore? No, you didn't. The situation evolved. Astana process was a process that Russia and Iran imposed on Turkey when Turkey did not have enough power to deal. Turkey was brought in and basically dictated solutions, and not because Turkey's an innocent party, but because Turkey was a weaker party at that time. That's the problem with the Astana process, is that it's presented as diplomacy, but a lot of diplomacy is coercion, arm twisting, and things of that nature. So, but that's why it's so important to figure out how we got it. Remember, the Arab states started investing in Syria long ago, but they were investing in getting rid of Assad. Money poured in. They started creating from these different communities of now radicalized population, with another returning radicalized population out of Turkey. You start to get things. Meanwhile, the West is coming in with all of its money. If you remember, there was a period of time when a guy named Jared Cohen, he was a he wrote a book about his travels around the Middle East. He spent some time in Lebanon with what he claims to be Hezbollah people, although Hezbollah purists were like, I don't think they were. They might have known some about Hezbollah, but I don't think he was talking to actual Hezbollah people because, but he's like, they're just like us. All they want to do is get on the internet and go around and bypass all this nonsense. Digital democracy was his thing. Digital democracy. It's beautiful. If we just bring the internet to the youth, they will change society. Digital democracy is wonderful. And then, they took this naive kid about digital democracy, brought him in the State Department, and all the old CIA people were going, yeah, tell us about this social influencing thing. And Jared may about that still believe it's digital, and the CIA is going, this is how we can overthrow governments. Digital democracy. We like this stuff. Yeah. Come on, boy. Tell me more about your digital democracy. And they took this and they started to undermine society. Google would come in, Facebook. Jared Cohen later on went to Facebook and was doing stuff. If you remember, there was a period of time when Jared Cohen, when he was with the State Department, Twitter was supposed to go down for maintenance during the Green Revolution in Iran. And Jared Cohen went to Twitter and said, keep it up, baby. We need Twitter right now because the people we trained that are inside Iran using digital democracy tools are out there doing their damnedest to create a information warfare against the regime by publishing things, and we need Twitter to stay up. Well, before there was Iran, I think Iran might have been the first one. I think Iran happened first. Those digital democracy tools were then applied to Syria. The West came in, and I always love it. I mean, I got confronted the other night. I did a book event in Washington, D.C., and I said, look, the black flag of jihad is risen over Damascus. Yeah. And it's a very sad day. I got confronted by a lady who brought in her ring and showed me the ring was the new flag of this Free Syrian, the Syrian National Army or whatever, the green stripes with the green stars and the red. And she said, this is the flag over Damascus. I said, no, it's not. This is the flag that's flying over that. And I said, but what is that flag? I mean, you didn't make up that flag. That's the flag of French colonial Syria imposed on you by the West that bought you. See, she won't admit it. She won't admit that she took the dime, the Western dime, and the Western training. She may have thought she was digital democracy. They created these little community groups throughout Syria where they gave them cameras and they gave them satellite phones. They gave them access, taught them how to access the internet. Then their job was to go in and film things and then put it straight on the internet so that the Western media could take clips of it and create the perception of a massive unrest, massive result. And so then they get upset when the Syrian Secret Service comes in and says, yeah, you're working for the CIA, you're working for British intelligence, Dutch intelligence, we're shutting you down, we're putting you in jail. Assad is terrorizing us. Assad is brutalized. Well, you took the CIA's money. I didn't know it was CIA. Well, that's how the CIA works, guys. They don't come in and say, remember Jared Cohen? Digital democracy. And the old CIA going, thank you very much, boy. Just digital democracy. We're going to take that one. We're going to run with it. And they ran with it in Syria with all the people went, we're just doing digital democracy. No, you're doing regime change. You know you're doing regime change. You're trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Now, you may think that's a good idea. I may think that's a good idea, although I didn't. I'm saying, but it doesn't matter. From Assad's perspective, it's not a good idea. It's illegal. And they will come at you with the tools of repression. So all these people are out there saying that I was innocent. There were no innocents in Syria. You're either with the government or you were against the government. There's no innocence. There were sides fighting. And when you're having this kind of fighting, it's an existential struggle and bad things happen. I'm not defending what happened. I'm just putting it in perspective when they say we were innocent. We were this, they put out this story of this guy in Deir al-Azur. I can't remember his name, but he was arrested.
Jelani, the one who.
No, Jelani's the head chopper. I'm talking about this. He's a Western educated activist who was arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and they kept showing his gaunt body, and then he ended up dying. The guy may have been an honorable man. I think he was. He may have believed in what he was doing. I think he did. He wanted democracy. I believe he did. I'm not saying anything bad about this guy. Shouldn't have died this way. But you picked a side, and you lost. And so he's not innocent. I just don't want to hear the term innocent. Please don't disgrace him that way. He's not innocent. He was fighting for what he believed in. He got captured by a regime that uses brutal tools of repression, and he died. But he's not innocent. There's no innocence here. I don't want to hear innocence. And if you're an activist who takes CIA money, whether it's directly or indirectly, understand it, you're not in control of what you're doing. That's the other thing I try to tell all these Syrian nationalists who've come out and you're not in control. You may think you're in control, but there's somebody else doing this, not because they like you, not because they believe in your cause, because they're using you as a tool to achieve a broader geopolitical purpose, which is to bring down Bashar al-Assad, to promote whatever other agenda is behind that. And so you have this, this uprising begins. People say it's a popular. There's nothing popular about that uprising. I've studied that uprising to the T. You have Turks coming in. You have the CIA setting up operations. They're pouring weapons out of Libya, sending it through Turkey, pouring billions of dollars of weapons, pouring it in there, money coming in from all the Gulf Arab states. And next thing you know, you have a free Syrian army. You have, al-Nusra, you have al-Qaeda, and later on you get ISIS. You get all these things happening down in Dara. None of it is
natural.
All of it is imposed. Some of it might have started as natural intent. But again, if I wake up one day and say, I'm going to run for office, okay, that's a natural. I'm going to oppose the superintendent town of Bethlehem. That's natural. And I start campaigning. And then the mafia comes up to me and says, "Hey, Scott, need some money, right? I saw you having trouble getting those advertisements out there. Yeah, I'm having trouble. Here's some money. But now, but now we need you to do this." I'm no longer in control. What might have started out as innocent I am now controlled by the people providing me money, guidance, etc. So all of this is controlled opposition. All of it. And much of it is controlled not by domestic interests, but by outside interests. You can't call what happened in Syria a civil war. A civil war is where people rise up from within and fight one another. What this was foreign-controlled opposition to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and it almost worked. Now, Assad is still struggling with the corruption. So what happened here is that the corrupt people were fighting for their lives. And the Syrian army was fighting for its life. But the Syrian army wasn't perfect, because there's a problem here. Even though these are foreign-controlled opposition, the people in the middle are Syrians caught up in the fighting. And no army likes to fire weapons at its people, at its families, at the relatives of families. And so no matter how much the generals and the corrupt governors and the corrupt officials, who all have their little economic fiefdoms. Remember, Syria is not functioning as a normal, viable Western-style society. You have Bashar al-Assad, who didn't want to be there but now is there, trying to get control over this corrupt regime and do reforms, but he can't now. And all those reforms stopped. There is no reform taking place when there is fighting. All the reforms that Bashar al-Assad was trying to bring in stopped. Now they have to fight for their lives, and they're failing. That's the other thing you have to understand. They weren't winning. As much as they fought, by 2014, the money was on the black flags going to fly over Damascus. The Iranians are there fighting because they had they have a history with Hezbollah. Syria supported them, so Iran and Hezbollah are supporting them, but that's not enough. It's not going to turn the tide. And the other problem is you have to be careful about bringing in sort of, I don't like to use the word fanatical, but true believers in the Shia revolution into a primarily Sunni state, especially when the pure believers of the Shia revolution view the Alawites as sort of a heretical offshoot of the Shia faith, and we're not really sure we're on the same side here. But there was this a shrine near Baghdad that the IRGC would come in to defend, and the defense of that shrine turned into, supporting. Then they maintained the resupply route through Syria for Hezbollah. That's how Hezbollah got all their rockets and everything is through this. And so there's this connectivity here. but it's not enough. So Qasem Soleimani, a name everybody should know, head of the Quds Force, the man assassinated by the United States and by President Trump, he flies to Moscow in 2015, and he tells the Russians, "Look, it's over. Syria is going to fall unless you do something." And so the decision was that Russia would intervene with primarily air power. They'd bring in some ground forces. Constitutionally, it's very difficult for Russia to deploy its main armed forces. So that's where Wagner came in. Wagner became a very heavy component of that. But there was, Russian military police. There was Russian generals doing command centers. There were select Russian forces that came in to stiffen up the Syrian army. But the main fighters were brought in from Iran. Iran brought in generals and stuff who worked with the Russians. They had a joint command center. And the generals brought in some IRGC units. But the majority of the fighting was done by IRGC proxies. Militias mobilized in Afghanistan and Iraq came in and they fought. The Iranians lost around 4,000 people between their IRGC and all that fight. This is heavy fighting. The Russians lost hundreds of people. But they turned the tide. They stabilized the situation. And by 2018, 2019, 2020, they're pushing back, recapturing territory. The Russians are intervening and saying, we're not going to kill all the jihadists. What we want you to do is displace them, move them up to Idlib. So we're going to clear out the countryside, move everything to Idlib, and then this is going to become a Turkish problem. The Turks, meanwhile, are looking at destabilization. They have the empowerment of the Kurds in southeastern part, American forces coming in, the Kurds renaming themselves so they're not terrorists in the eyes of the Americans anymore, but yet they're still encouraging Turkish or Kurdish uprising. So the Turks intervene to stop that. Turks come down to salvage what they're doing, because remember, the Turks had heavily invested in overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. Erdogan went from being his nice older brother to the man saying, you got to go, you're a dictator, you're a brutal dictator, etc. So the Turks are involved. Now that the Russians and the Iranians have intervened, it's Russia and Iran against Turkey. And that's where the Astana process comes in, because the Turks early on shot down a Russian airplane and the Russians went, you don't get to do that. So the Turks came to Astana, and arm twisting, Putin laying the law down for Erdogan, and Erdogan agrees to a series of imperfect ceasefires and agreements that led to, in the end, you remember the Turks had built these fortified positions protecting highways and areas,
right.
And
M4 highway, I believe.
Use those to have forces sorting out. And the Russians attacked a Turkish column and killed a bunch of Turkish soldiers. And the Turks, and then at that time, the Russians said, you don't get to flex down here. And the final Astana agreement was reached, which was a very bitter pill for the Turks to swallow. So then you have this imposed, stability. The Battle of Aleppo, the Syrian government took it over. It was the Iranians who won Aleppo, backed by the Air Force. There were Syrians fighting, but the Syrian army did go. The Syrian army went from around 300,000 men at that time. It shrunk down to about 170,000.
Oh, wow.
And they weren't able to get it above that. So in the Syrian army at this time is still run by, you have some generals that are very effective in combat. Like I said, though, in wartime, the rules don't matter. So these generals come in and they're commanding, but they're still corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
They're still taking money, putting in their pockets, building their villas, taking care of their people. You know who's not being taken care of? The average Syrian soldier. But he's fighting for his country. So now peace breaks out all over. There was never pure peace, but it breaks out. And the corrupt people go back to being corrupt. The generals are corrupt. And they have a lot of catching up to do because they had fought from 2011 up until 2018. The Russians come in, take a look at this, and they say, hey, Bashar, you gotta change this. Your military is dysfunctional. Every time ISIS started to sortie out and take Palmyra, your guys ran. We had to come in and recapture it. We, the Russians, had to come in and recapture it. It's time that you learn to hold things and you learn how to recapture things. You've got to reform your entire military. But the problem is, to reform the military, you have to get rid of the corrupt generals and put in actual generals. And the corrupt generals are the ones who saved Bashar al-Assad. They're the ones during the fighting are sitting down with Assad, having dinner, having lunch, talking, bonding, And Assad's like, no, these are the guys that saved me. These are the guys that saved me. I can't. No. I'm not going to do that. These guys are telling me everything's okay, and they won. Well, Bashar, they didn't win without us. Yes, but that's okay. We're good. We're good. We don't need reforms. And the Russians like, you really do need reforms. And he turned down the reforms. The Iranians are coming in and saying similar things. And then the Iranians went to the Russians and said, all right, if they're not going to reform, we have to double down. We got to bring in more Iranian troops. We got to bring in and all that. And the Russians went, you can't do that. We have an agreement with Israel that we're not going to let the problems in Syria turn Syria into an Iranian base.
Right.
Thank you for your help, but you guys don't get to come in and bring in divisions and all this stuff. You got to stay out. And that created some tension between Russia and Iran. So you got the Russians telling the Syrians to reform. You got the Iranians who recognize the Syrians aren't reforming, therefore they need reinforcement. And neither one of those things are happening because Bashar al-Assad has been lulled into a false sense of complacency and complicity that everything's fine. So now you have a situation. Here's the final thing. The West is conspiring. Remember, the West isn't just because they got beat. Turkey is pouring funding into the HTS.
Yeah,
these
they didn't stop.
Right. Al-Qaeda people. The new Syrian or the Free Syrian Army, which is another faction there, the West is pouring money in. And the CIA is still running around. Guys, the CIA never sleeps. Please understand that these alcoholic case officers are out there drinking their whiskey. And how do we get these boys? How do we get these boys? What are we going to do? Where's their weakness? What's going on? How are we getting there? And suddenly Bashar goes, I want to be reformed in the eyes of the Arab League.
Right.
And Bashar goes, I want to get back. And the CIA is going, oh, I like this. This boy needs some money. He needs some investment. And then they go and talk to their buddies in Saudi Arabia and Oman. They go, he's going to come to you and he's going to ask you for a lot of money, and you're going to give it to him. But you're going to give him to this person, this person, and this person, and this person, because I've been making the phone calls and saying, hey, you're going to get a lot of money, a whole bunch of money, and we need you to come over to the dark side. And I'm absolutely positive, I can't prove this, but I'm positive that many of these corrupt people, these governors, these were receiving money, this new influx of money, and corruption is absolute. Here's the other problem too. The United States sanctions Syria.
Yes.
All right. Now people can do a lot during wartime. People tighten belts, people make sacrifices, but in times of peace, they want things to go back to being normal. They want things to be rebuilt. And there was the facade of reconstruction. Aleppo got rebuilt, Damascus got rebuilt, cafeterias happened, and all this kind of stuff. But that's fake. That's a veneer. Underneath it is corruption. And the sanctions create more corruption because the first thing that happens in a sanctioned economy is you get a black market economy. And that is the antithesis. And who's running the black market? The generals, they are the mafia, and they're running the black market. And so nothing's happening. They're just getting richer and richer. And the soldier who just went through all this fighting, all these dead soldiers, all these wounded soldiers with no legs, no arms coming back, they're not getting the care they need. There's a lot of resentment happening right now.
Yeah.
Because corruption goes downhill. I mean, you may be a captain who says, I'm not corrupt, I believe in my men, but then you go home and your wife says, the kids are hungry, honey. Did you get paid last month?
Yeah.
Paid, honey, but just hold on a little bit longer. The money's going to come. And then you go visit the colonel and ask where the money is. And the colonel's sitting there drinking wine and eating. He's fat and he's surrounded by, women and song and dance. And he says, sir, where's the money for the men and me? You'll get paid. Get out of here. And they leave. And I think the Syrian army just stopped believing in the reforms that the Russians said were needed. And the thing is, this is happening. So I can put a uniform on a soldier. I can give him the kit. I can give him the weapon. And he looks like a soldier. And with the new kit, people will look at him and say, hey, he's got that Russian style helmet and all that. And he looks like those Russians that are fighting like animals. I mean, they're and I don't mean that bad. I mean, like,
I know what you mean. Yeah, I know what you mean.
So he must be an animal too. He must be a warrior because he looks like a warrior. But inside is the heart of a warrior. Inside is the heart of a conscript who says, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
I don't believe in this corruption. I don't believe in this. I don't want to be here. So they're there. It's a veneer. Now HTS is out there being funded by the Turks. I believe if you study the battle for Idlib, one of the final battles was because HTS was refusing to abide by the conditions imposed on Syria, on Turkey through Astana. The Russians and the Syrians, launched an offensive that drove them out of. There's supposed to be a highway that's supposed to be patrolled by the Russians and the Turks and all that. And the HTS was fighting. So they came in and they pushed them out, and the Russians took control of the highway, and the Syrian army took control of the highway. That was seen as a strategic defeat for HTS, and then the war. So HTS started this offensive simply to recapture the highway. That's it.
And just kept going when they realized that they weren't getting out.
And they came in, they were expecting some fighting. They come in and they go, well, that was easy. Let's keep going. And so they kept going. They said, and they got guys, they got sleeper cells in there, and the sleeper cells rise up in Aleppo and go, there ain't nothing here. So they come into Aleppo, and Aleppo falls. And they're like, well, keep going. And they keep going. And all those guys that look like animals said, we're not doing this again. We're not doing what we did before. We're not going to repeat the sacrifice that we made, because the sacrifice we made was supposed to free Syria, but instead it created this fiefdom of corruption, and we're just not going to fight for that anymore. And they threw down their there it is. They threw down their guns, their uniform, and they just walked away. They just said, no, we're not going to do this. And this is what happened. And then it's opportunism. The Syrian National Army didn't participate in the initial attacks, because there was some infighting between them and HTS. But then the Syrian National Army went, whoa, we can't let them go and grab all the stuff. So they start coming down. So now you got movement taking place. And down in Jordan, this thing called the Southern Operations Center, which was the rebels, or the foreign-backed rebels that had been pushed out of Dara. They go, why don't we try this? And they come in, and instead of getting a hail of gunfire and all that, nothing. They come in, nothing. And next thing you know, it's done. Black flag over Damascus. Assad has flown out. Nobody predicted this.
No,
when I first started, I thought, I bought into a narrative that said that this was part of a. Now I will say this: there's no doubt that there's Turkish money, Turkish training, CIA money, CIA training. The Ukrainians were in there training them about drones and all this stuff. But I bought into the notion because, forgive me, guy. There's a lot of people out there. Ritter owes us an apology. I'm not going to apologize, man. I was wrong.
I saw that.
You got it wrong, but I'll tell you why I got it wrong.
Nobody predicted this. Nobody saw this.
170,000 soldiers, and I come from a Marine Corps background. I mean, I'm going to fight, and I just thought they'd fight. I thought what I wrote early on is I said they've withdrawn to regroup, but the Russians will come in with the Air Force, the Iranians will come in with their. And they're going to repeat what happened before.
Right. In 2015.
Solidify, and then they'll push it back. There was no reason for me not to believe that was going to happen, because that's past precedent. They have 170,000 soldiers who haven't been fighting hard for a couple of years, so they should be regrouped, refreshed, etc. What I didn't realize, nobody realized, is that the soldiers weren't going to do it again. They weren't going to go through that again, because they lost faith in everything. This corruption was so manifest, so insipid, so utterly, it had reached its tendrils into everything. And nobody, because Bashar al-Assad, I tell you what, he gives a great interview. And he can walk around parts of Damascus and be treated like a hero. He can walk around. What it turns out is that this was all carefully controlled state propaganda. Now, we knew it was state propaganda to begin with. I mean, nobody's dumb enough. But the confidence that he exuded, the words he used, people like me watched it and went, all right, I think this guy's going to try and be the reformer he's promised to be. Yeah. What none of us, and even the people who lived in Syria. I mean, Vanessa Beeley lives in Syria.
Oh, man.
And Vanessa
she didn't know. I mean, I spoke to her when this was happening, and she was like, "No, there's going to be a deal. Everything is going to be fine." And then 2 days later, it's over with.
But my question, Vanessa, is: didn't you see the corruption? You lived there.
Yeah.
I mean, you lived there. I mean, as an analyst, I can't forgive myself. My job is to see these things. I didn't.
Yeah,
maybe I was blinded. I was blinded by this, but she lived there. So many people, so many of these analysts lived there and worked there. Didn't they see the corruption? Didn't they see the problems? Didn't they see the indifference? Because there has to be, because it isn't just that the Syrian army quit. I'm here to tell you right now, I'm a civilian nowadays, but black flag jihadists rolling to Delmar, I am grabbing a knife. I'm ambushing the first one I find, taking his weapons, and I'm killing the next one I find, and I'm arming my neighbors, and we're forming a Delmar Self-Defense Association. And if the army's not going to defend us, we're going to defend us, because this is my family. The nation quit. Everybody quit.
Well, Scott,
nobody.
Real quick, because we have about 2 minutes left, and I want to get this question in. Is this going to devolve into something like Libya? That is my biggest fear. When I saw Iraq, Libya, and then this happens, and it was like, Iraq, initially Bush says everything is great, the war is over with, and then it goes to shit in a heartbeat. Do you expect, we have about 2 minutes left, do you expect the same thing to happen to Syria?
It's already happened. Giuliani didn't. I'll tell you why I know that this outcome wasn't planned, because nobody would put Giuliani in charge. Nobody would put an Al-Qaeda head chopper in charge. Nobody would put that in charge. There would be a government in exile. The Syrian National Army had a government in exile. They would have been prepped. They would have been ready. They would have had their suits on and their ties on, and the Turks would have driven them in and said, "You're in charge." They're still on vacation wherever they were, because they're corrupt too. Everything's corrupt, and they haven't organized. Giuliani comes in and says, "I'm in charge." And now what he's done is he said, "Yeah, the transitional government will be my fellow head choppers. I'm bringing in my fellow head choppers up there in Idlib. They're coming in. There will be civil war. There will be violence. Look at Israel. They're having a field day right now, just blowing everything up, because they have to. From the Israeli perspective, yay, Assad's gone, but he had a whole bunch of Scud missiles. We're not going to let these head chopping idiots have Scud missiles, so they're blowing those up. They're blowing up. He has tanks. They're blowing up all this, so that there's no situation like Libya, where a whole bunch of weaponry suddenly falls in the hands of people. But that weaponry already has fallen in the hands of people. This is going to be a disaster for decades. And every one of these Syrian patriots that are cheering in the streets of Europe and in the streets of Damascus, mark my words, in 3 years you'll be crying. There's a man, it's an interview that's going around, a man who tore down the statue of Saddam Hussein when Baghdad fell. And today he said, "I wish I hadn't done that. I wish Saddam Hussein had stayed in power." The Libyans dream about the time of Gaddafi, because back then, peace, prosperity, everything. Bashar al-Assad isn't a Gaddafi. He isn't a Saddam Hussein. He was an accidental president who failed to live up to what he wanted to do. And maybe he needed to go. But the way he went here, this is just going to destroy Syria, cause it to fracture apart. And I think Syria is going to get carved up too. That's the other thing. If you think the Turks are walking away from Aleppo, you don't know anything about the Ottoman Empire, the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, and how angry the Turks are that Aleppo was given to Syria. To them, Aleppo, the vilayet of Aleppo, is a Turkish vilayet. And watch this. Iraq, Turks are coming after Mosul, because that's the other historical issue they have out there. So this is transforming the region. It's a whole new game. Yeah.
One last question. Something you said about CNN. CNN interviewed Giuliani, and they basically interviewing a terrorist and softball the fact that the man was a head chopping terrorist. You pointed out that you were in the room as they were setting up, I guess, propaganda exercises like that. Could you go into that? We have about 1 or 2 minutes before the next guest comes on, but please go into that.
No, just in 2002, I was invited to the headquarters of CNN in Atlanta. I had just come back from Iraq, where I spoke to the parliament, and and also had just, I'd been advocating for the return of weapons inspectors. And then, Saddam Hussein said, we're going to let weapons inspectors back in. And I take credit for at least playing a part in putting that thought in the minds of the Iraqi government and helping convince them it's the right thing to do. So CNN, after attacking me, brought me in and had a big panel who interviewed me and all that. And the CEO and the director of their news operations stands up and goes, Scott Ritter is cleared now. He can go on. He's passed the purity test. And then he takes me and he goes, let me show you what we're doing here. And he takes me in, he shows me the war room. And we're talking October 2002. The war room. Already hotlines of the Pentagon, already reporters getting trained and prepared to be embedded in invasion forces. CNN is getting ready to be the propaganda arm of the Defense Department as they go into an Iraqi invasion that hadn't been approved yet. Hadn't been officially approved. The president was still saying we're working for peace, but CNN already knows what the outcome is going to be. They're preferred. I was also working with CNN, or when the CIA brought CNN in when I was a weapons inspector, to create a propaganda film about the weapons inspections. CNN and the CIA are the same. And this interview that was done, handpicked reporter, script, and the CIA said you have to go in and you got to make Jolani look good.
Wow.
And CNN went in there and did what they had to do. This ridiculous interview. But CNN's not a news organization. CNN is state-controlled, not state-controlled, CIA-controlled media. 100%.
Propaganda outlet. Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector of mass destruction, whistleblower. Scott, man, always appreciate you, Scott. You can find Scott on Telegram at Scott Ritter. Thank you for this, Scott. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for the context.
Thanks for having me come on. Good luck.
Absolutely.